Welcome back to The Explainer. So today, we're basically opening our playbills to dive into something incredibly fascinating, a really grim, dark, gothic fable. We're stepping onto the stage of The Gilded Hollow. It's essentially a psychodynamic tragedy. We're going to look at what happens when the human mind just completely turns against itself and starts treating its own existence as nothing more than a bad theatrical play.
Okay, so right off the bat, we need to set the psychological stakes here. A healthy ego is supposed to be the mediator, right? It balances our primal underground urges with the strict rules of the outside world. But a maladaptive ego, it completely fails at that job. It resorts to these really destructive defense mechanisms, specifically clinical detachment and relentless irony. And our main character today, the jester, well, he is the ultimate clinical case study of this failing ego. So the stakes here are absolutely massive.
Here is tonight's playbill. We'll start with Act 1, The Gilded Stage, then move into Act 2, Weaponizing Irony, followed by Act 3, Feeding the Id, Act 4, The Void Mirror, and finally, an epilogue looking at Das Wanderer. Together, we're going to dissect the architecture of irony and its catastrophic consequences on the mind.
Let's pull back the curtain on Act 1, The Gilded Stage. Imagine a grand theater of the mind, but it's disguised as this towering, imposing courtroom. Up top, you have the high judge. He represents the strict superego, the earnest order of the psyche. But then you have the jester. He arrives exactly in the gap where authority draws breath. And he doesn't wear the explicit insignias of a rebel, because, that would be way too earnest. Instead, he wears this many-colored coat of irony. It's totally patched together from these bled-out, borrowed philosophies.
Okay, let's dive into this. Act 2, Weaponizing Irony, and the jester's theoretical allergy to authority.
The jester looks around at the grand columns of this internal tribunal, the literal pillars of the mind's morality, and he just cynically waves them off as very serious furniture. It's all a joke to him. He treats every throne as a cheap stage prop, every law is just a stage direction. He's dancing around, juggling the gavel when the judge isn't looking. To him, earnestness isn't just silly, he finds it genuinely offensive.
What's really interesting here is how completely opposite these two are. The high judge is desperately trying to hold everything together, acting as an earnest arbiter, but he's relying on this fragile illusion of value. The jester, on the other hand, is just clinically unmaking it all. He sees the judge as merely a foolish actor who forgot he's in a play, totally missing the point that the theater itself is the only thing keeping the psyche from collapsing. Now, you might be thinking this is some kind of righteous rebellion. Actually, scratch that. It's not. The jester isn't driven by the rage of the oppressed. He's constitutionally incapable of taking anything personally. He only hates the high judge in theory. For him, a clinical active nihilism, just deconstructing the stage entirely, is a sufficient act. He doesn't want to write a better play. He literally just wants to empty the theater. Which brings us to the really dark stuff. Act 3, Feeding the Id. To bring the house down, the jester needs chaos. So every single night, when the hollow sleeps, he sneaks down into the dark spaces beneath the floorboards. Down there, he whispers the day's legal proceedings to Von Nixt, the tarantula, the embodiment of the primal resentful id. And of course, the jester masks this highly destructive behavior in the beautiful philosophical language of liberation. But come on, it's not liberation. He's literally just poking a wasp's nest. He's feeding the id's resentment, not because they're allies, but simply because he wants to see what happens when the structures fail. And the wildest part? He does all of this completely detached, making sure he never has to take responsibility for the absolute chaos he's brewing. And that leads us to the climax of our dark fable. Act 4, The Void Mirror. So how does a mind completely collapse? Well, it happens in a very specific sequence. First, you mock authority with endless irony. Second, you feed von Nietzsche, brewing deep resentment. Third, you unveil the void mirror. And finally, you trigger the total dissolution of the high judge. Because of the jester's complete allergy to authority, he basically guarantees that the walls of the mind are eventually going to speak with the tarantula's voice. Step 3 is the true apotheosis of this performance. Picture this. The jester steps right up to the high judge, completely strips away the courtroom's illusions, and unveils the void mirror. He forces the superego to look directly into a reflection of absolute nothingness. The judge sees his own purposeless core.
He realizes his earnest authority was just a desperate performance all along. The glass cracks, the stage shatters, and an inescapable inferno of nihilism just completely consumes the psyche. If we trace this entire timeline, you can see how brilliant and horrifying this is. We fall from the earnest order of the Gilded Era, right through the jester's intermission of irony, into the shattering of the void mirror. But the jester doesn't get his so-called liberation. By unmaking the stage, he just creates a massive vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum, right? So from the ashes of the high judge rises the red judge, an unthinking, brutal machine of pure retribution. The jester completely played himself.
Finally, let's look at the epilogue, Das Wanderha.
We really need to contrast the jester's clinical failure with a constructive path forward. The jester relied entirely on destructive irony. But Das Wanderer? Das Wanderer represents the Nietzschean spirit of becoming. If we look at the philology here, the word to overcome, überwinden, doesn't mean to just destroy. It means to conquer and elevate. Das Wanderer refuses cheap, easy deconstruction. They choose the much harder work of self-overcoming, moving past those hollow symbols to actually harmonize the psyche as a creative architect. So, what does this all mean for us? Why does understanding this psychological theater matter? Well, because deconstruction alone is a trap. Irony, without a foundation of earnestness, just breeds nihilism. Your ego has to mediate between the forces in your mind, not just mock them. True liberation isn't about tearing down the stage props and watching the theater burn. It's about self-overcoming. Which leaves me with a question for you. When you look at the structures, the rules, and the authorities on your own internal stage, are you going to dismantle it all with endless irony? Or will you step up and become the creative architect of a new one? Thank you so much for joining me to explore the Gilded Hollow. Keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.